captured the significance of Obama's improbable rise and the sense of optimism that he engendered about the future. So for many, Obama, at least at the time, was a symbol of a reconciled or a reconciling nation that was expressing its best self. And who can forget Obama's own words that were first uttered a few years before he won the presidency? There's not a liberal America and a conservative America. There's only the United States of America. Now, early 2008 seems like a very long time ago. I don't get asked for IDs anymore in bars, and America looks very different. The 22 midterms are upon us, and no US politician could credibly utter those words today. Turns out there is a liberal America, there is a conservative America, and we have, and this is the phrase we see a lot of now in the papers, that we have the divided states of America. The smell of national decline is in the air. Americans seem to be appalled by the state of their society, irrespective of what side of the political aisle they're on. Trust in institutions has collapsed. Moral indignation is everywhere. And disdain for the establishment, for these so-called elites, has reached extreme levels. Now, of course, Donald Trump looms large in all of this, but the conditions that brought him to power and that continue to make him dangerous were decades in the making, and I don't think they're going away anytime soon. So this evening I'm going to talk a little bit about these conditions. I'm going to consider some of their present-day consequences, and I'm going to peer into the future and reflect on where the United States might be going and what this could mean for Americans and also for the world. And I think the midterms are a useful launching pad for this. The political fault lines that they've exposed suggest that the United States finds itself in a situation without historical precedent, or certainly with little historical precedent. And some state the point a bit more bluntly than me, that American democracy itself is in danger. So the midterms. Let's think about them. What do we need to know, and what's the state of play? So I don't know the current state of play, but as of 3 hours ago when I was putting down some of these thoughts, I thought there are a few observations worth making. The first thing I'd say is that the Democrats hold the House of Reps at the moment by a margin of just 10 seats out of 435, and that makes it the narrowest margin of any House majority since the mid-1950s. They also have no majority at all in the Senate, which is split 50-50, and they rely on the tie-breaking vote of the Vice President, Kamala Harris. So to gain control of the Congress, Republicans only need to flip 5 House seats and 1 Senate seat. The second thing I'd say is that, unlike presidential elections, predicting who will win the midterms is usually really quite easy. Local issues and candidates play a role, but the outcome of midterms is largely an indication of how Americans feel about how the president's performing. The President's Party has lost seats in all but 2 of the 19 midterm elections since the Second World War, and the exceptions are 2002 and 1998. So 2002 you can probably work out, just after 9/11, George W. Bush at that time enjoyed very, very high popularity rating of about 63-64%. 9/11's just happened. They've just ousted the Taliban in Afghanistan and things seem to be going quite well. The Republicans won additional seats that year. And 4 years before that, Bill Clinton, a very popular second-term president, also manages to win some seats in the midterms. But they're the exceptions. A big worry for Joe Biden is that with an approval rating in the low 40s, his popularity is close to where Donald Trump's was 4 years ago. And in the 2018 midterms, Trump lost 40 seats. The Republicans lost 40 seats. An even bigger worry for Biden is the longer-term trend in this regard. So in the 9 other elections where the president's approval rating has been below 50%, the party has lost an average of 37 seats in the House. So this makes it historically unlikely that the Democrats are going to hold on to the House this year. The situation in the Senate is only slightly better for the president's party if you look at history. But this year may be different. I don't want to say it will be different, but it could be more favourable to the Democrats, despite the fact that the Republicans only need to flip 1 seat. Because only a third of the Senate seats have been contested at each midterm election, one party often needs to defend far more seats than the other. And this year, Republicans are defending 20 seats, Democrats are defending 14 seats. And a lot of these races are very close. So for this reason, quite a few pundits are favouring the Democrats to retain control of the Senate, but not all, and I don't think even most. Doug Schoen, who's a prominent Democratic pollster in the US, he worked as a senior advisor for Bill Clinton on his 1996 campaign, put out a tweet the other day saying that America should brace for a Republican wave. Another fairly well-regarded pollster, Robert Carley, who predicted Trump's victory in 2016 against all the odds, agrees with this and expects Republicans to easily take control of both of the houses. So the argument that he makes to substantiate the claim here is that traditional public opinion polls no longer capture a silent majority of conservative voters who are increasingly unwilling to speak publicly about their political views for fear of what they see as government retribution. But they're people who are still going, so goes the argument, they're still going to turn out to vote on election day. So the issues in these midterms are fairly plain to see. Republicans so far have focused a huge amount of their attention on Joe Biden, the failed president. Their words, not mine. They have also attacked the Democrats for inflation. They've warned of a coming recession, and they've put a heavy spotlight on crime, rising crime, illegal immigration at the southern border, and school curriculum, who would have thought, what's being taught in the schools. So in a nutshell, their messaging has centred around people's economic frustrations and their cultural fears, and also around the federal government's alleged hastening of America's decline. That's the Republican line on all of this. Now, until the middle of the year, all the momentum was with the Republicans, and there was a lot of talk of a red wave sweeping sort of the Congress. But in June, as we I think all know, and as Ross mentioned, the Supreme Court overturned national abortion protections. Since then, Democrats have made a woman's right to choose a central theme of many of their campaigns, and they have reaped some political benefit from that. They've also made, not surprisingly, democracy an election issue. Again, who would have thought this a few years ago, but nevertheless, democracy is now an election issue. Specifically, they've sounded the alarm that Trump's Republican base is increasingly authoritarian or semi-fascist, with the rise of these people called the election deniers, who are still refusing to accept that Biden won the presidential election in 2020. Now, against this backdrop, the House Select Committee's hearings have been going on into the January 6 riots, and hit a peak of 20 million viewers in June. And what these viewers saw and heard was fairly compelling evidence of Trump's culpability in the violence that took place that day. The committee's work, I would argue, has been morally and legally important, but Trump's favourability is now actually 3 percentage points higher than when the first public hearing was held. So they haven't shifted any position really on Trump. So clear battle lines, high stakes. If the Democrats defy the odds and manage to hang on, Biden will be able to push forward with his plans on climate change, on expanding public health care, abortion rights, gun restrictions, the list goes on. But if the Republicans take control of either House or Senate, they'll be able to throw out most of Biden's agenda. For starters, they'll be able to end the inquiry into the January 6th attack on the US Capitol by Trump supporters. They might launch new investigations into the business dealings of Joe Biden's son, Hunter, or an investigation into the southern withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan. It would be very difficult for Biden to make any new appointments, most notably to the Supreme Court. I think it's you have to go back to the late 19th century for when a Republican Senate confirmed a Democratic presidential nominee to the Senate, to the Supreme Court. So that's not going to happen. And then there's foreign policy. A Republican ascendancy would significantly hamper Biden's foreign policy, particularly in relation to Ukraine and the support for Ukraine that's currently being given. So all of this, I think, if you were to summarise it, you would say it spells more gridlock in Washington, something that America can really ill afford right now. But the most significant consequences of these midterms would arguably be for the presidential elections in 2024. First, the midterms could give us a strong clue as to who might be in the running to be the Republican presidential candidate. I think it's likely to be Trump, but if candidates that he supported do badly in the next 24 hours, he's less likely, I would argue, to get the backing of the Republican Party to run for president again. I'm not saying it wouldn't happen, but it would be unlikely. At the same time, if the Democrats can hold on to power in states like Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, these are all swing states, they'll feel more confident about their campaign to get Biden re-elected, if indeed Biden is going to run again. He's about to turn 80. I think he just did turn 80. The second point I'd make is that these midterms can be viewed as a watershed for free and fair elections in America. Now, of course, Trump has continued to claim that the 2020 election was stolen from him, and hundreds of Republican candidates have certainly echoed these claims in recent weeks and months, and will no doubt go on echoing them. In fact, this was how many of them actually managed to secure Trump's endorsements in the first place and get their nominations. A number of these candidates are now seeking statewide positions that could give them considerable influence over the 2024 presidential election, especially the offices of Governor and Secretary of State, which have ultimate responsibility for certifying election results in most states. So I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But first, just a little bit of history here. It might help us grasp the significance of all, or at least some of this. This isn't the first time that the United States has experienced political upheaval over the past century. The 1930s Great Depression caused Americans to doubt the country's economic system. World War II and the Cold War brought fairly serious threats from totalitarian regimes. The 60s and the 70s had assassinations and riots and a losing war and a corrupt president in Richard Nixon. These early periods were each more alarming in some ways, I'd argue, than anything that has happened in the United States recently. Yet during each of those previous times of upheaval, the basic dynamics of American democracy held up or held firm. candidates who won the most votes were able to take power and attempt to address the country's problems. The current period is different. America's democracy, I think, genuinely faces a new threat, which represents the most serious challenge to the country's governing ideals since the Civil War in the 1860s. The threat, of course, is this growing movement inside, one of the major two parties in the country, the Republican Party, to refuse to accept the defeat in the election a couple of years ago. The violent attack on the Congress at the start of last year, which was supposed to prevent the certification of Biden's election victory, was the clearest manifestation of this movement, obviously. But it's continued and probably grown in force. In fact, about 2/3 of Republican voters still say that Biden did not win the 2020 election legitimately, which is extraordinary. And among Republican candidates running for statewide office this year, 47% have refused to accept the 2020 result. So if enough of these election deniers prevail in key states in the next 24 hours, they will potentially, as I've sort of already suggested, be in a position to overturn the presidential election in 2024. So for the first time in American history, a legitimately elected president may not be able to take office. I think that is a serious possibility in a couple of years. So Barack Obama and Joe Biden, different kind of orators, but they have said recently the same thing about the midterms, that democracy is on the ballot, and it's hard to disagree with them. The big question is, how did this happen? How did it come to this? I think the current situation has a number of causes. There are short-term causes, there are long-term causes. The first thing I'd say here is that the roots of the election denier movement, that's what I'm calling it, stretch back to 2008. When Obama was running for president and after he won, you might recall, some of his critics falsely claimed that his victory was illegitimate because he was born in Kenya rather than Hawaii. So most of you will remember this. That movement became known as birtherism, and Trump, then a reality TV star, was its leading mouthpiece. Years later, in 2016, when he was running for president himself, Trump made false claims about election fraud central to his campaign. That's often forgotten. So in the Republican primaries in 2016, he accused his greatest rival for the nomination, Ted Cruz, of cheating. Then in the general election against Hillary Clinton, he said he would only accept the outcome if he won. In 2020, after Biden defeated him, surprise, surprise, the election lies became Trump's dominant political message. So I would trace this election denying phenomenon to the birther phenomenon 14 years ago. But I think America's current problems run much deeper than Trump, as I sort of said in the introduction today. I would cite the frustration of the lower middle class and working white poor after half a century of slow-growing living standards. This group makes up about 40% of the population. I would cite cultural fears felt by the same group, that the US is being transformed into a different kind of country, less religious, more racially diverse, and with rapidly changing attitudes to things like gender and language and other things as well. A chasm has clearly opened up, is what I'm suggesting, in American politics between people who are struggling, or certainly feel they're struggling, in smaller cities, traditional cities, rural areas, and people who are living in more well-to-do, diverse metropolitan areas. The first group is increasingly conservative and Republican. Second group is increasingly liberal and democratic. So I'm essentially talking about two different cultures here, two rival ways of life. Both groups overwhelmingly believe that democracy is in danger of collapse, but they disagree fundamentally on the nature of the threat, and each group thinks the other's views are so objectionable that they can't even be debated, that they shouldn't be debated. So in this environment, it's very hard for the party based in one culture to reach out and win votes in the other culture, or even to understand what people in that other culture are thinking. So the contest seems almost existential, with disagreements over virtually every issue. Liliana Mason, political scientist, author of a very good book titled Uncivil Agreement, How Politics Became Our Identity, has put it like this, and I quote, "When we're voting, we're not just voting for a set of policies, but for what we think makes us Americans and who we are as people. If our party loses the election, then all of these parts of us feel like losers." Okay, all of these parts of us feel like losers. So you have this divergent sense of crisis on the right and on the left. It's there, it's very obvious, and it's been undeniably exacerbated by technology. Okay, in the US in particular, I think, no one's immune from this, but it seems a particularly acute problem in the United States. It seems like everybody has their own facts. Misinformation spreads, more people buy into conspiracy theories. Increasingly, they're convinced by stories that someone is trying to trick them, that the world or the government or the Democrats are against them. Distrust is the thing that motivated a lot of people to vote for Trump in the first place, to stick their thumb in the eye of the elites. But the rhetoric keeps getting ratcheted up by extremists on the fringes. Nancy Pelosi is a would-be dictator. Joe Biden is a communist. Democrats want Republicans dead, and they have already started the killings. These are just some quotes taken from Twitter over the last week. So you start seeing narratives of hate emerge. Public life is no longer an exchange of ideas, it's a conflict of groups engaged in a vicious death struggle. Civility in this equation becomes a kind of code for capitulation to those who want to destroy the country. So this is what political breakdown looks like, I would argue. So it wasn't supposed to be this way in the United States. If you think back to the early 1990s, time of sort of triumphant globalisation, certainly a time of American hegemony. One political scientist called it the unipolar moment. The New York Times columnist David Brooks has written really persuasively about some of this. Internationally at that time, communism was falling, apartheid was ending, the Arab-Israeli dispute was calming down, Europe was unifying. At home, a moderate Republican president named George H. Bush, the first one, gave way to the first baby boomer president in Bill Clinton. The American economy was growing quite nicely. The racial gap was narrowing. All the systems of society seemed to be working, or at least to be working better. Capitalism, democracy, pluralism, diversity, globalisation, and so on. But when you look back at that now, those sorts of judgments seem quite naive. And Brooks, in a column he recently wrote, more or less admits this. He says, we were naive about what the globalised economy would do to the working class. Naive to think that the internet would bring us together. Naive to think the global mixing of people would breed harmony. Naive to think the privileged wouldn't pull up the ladders of opportunity behind them. And few would have predicted, or could have predicted, the three major crises that have confronted the United States in the short 21st century. The first crisis was on September 11, 2001, of course. And on that day, conservatives in the red states did not see New York as some kind of foreign site full of immigrants and liberals that deserved their fate. but as a great American city that had taken a hit for the whole country. People helped each other out across the political divide. Americans' civic reflex was to mourn and to come together, to mobilise together. But partisan politics and really, really bad policies, especially the Iraq War, I think that's the single worst decision in American foreign policy history. That erased the sense of national unity and fed a bitterness towards the political class that I would argue has never really faded. The second crisis was a few years later, 2008, the global financial crisis, which sort of intensifies this situation. At the top, the financial crisis could almost be considered a success. Congress passed a bipartisan bailout bill that saved the financial system. Outgoing Bush administration officials cooperated very well with incoming Obama administration officials. The experts at the Federal Reserve and at the Treasury Department used monetary policy and fiscal policy to prevent a second Great Depression. Leading bankers were shamed for a time, but not prosecuted. Most of them kept their fortunes, and some of them kept their jobs. Before long, they were back in business. All of the lasting pain was felt in the middle and at the bottom by Americans who had taken on debt and lost their jobs, lost their homes, lost their retirement savings. Many of them never recovered. And young people who sort of came of age in this Great Recession are doomed now to be poorer than their parents if things keep going the way they're going. So inequality, the fundamental, relentless force in American life since the late 70s has grown worse, is growing worse. So this second crisis, the GFC, drove a really big wedge, a profound wedge between Americans. This is what I'm arguing. Between the upper and lower classes, between Republicans and Democrats, between metropolitan and rural people, the native-born and immigrants, ordinary Americans and their leaders. Now, I've already spoken a bit about this. Social bonds had been under growing strain for several decades, and they now really began to tear apart. The long recovery over the past decade enriched corporations and investors, lulled professionals, left the working class further behind. And the lasting effect of the slump was to increase polarisation and to discredit authority, especially the authority of government. But both parties were very slow to grasp how much credibility they'd lost in the eyes of voters. So by the time the third sort of big crisis comes along, and that's COVID, of course, America was a country with really serious problems. A despised political class, a really stale bureaucracy, a faltering economy, a divided public. The pandemic, more than anything, I think, exposed the severity of the problems and revealed a broken nation that was unable to unite against a common threat. There was no output, there was no crossing of boundaries like there had been in the days after 9/11. COVID should have been a great leveller. Instead, attitudes broke down along familiar partisan lines and the divisions grew deeper. Social distancing, mask wearing, vaccinations, they came to be seen not so much as public health measures, but as political markers. So in short, the crisis demanded a response that was swift, that was rational, and that was collective. Instead, Americans got the opposite from their government. They got ineptitude, they got dysfunction, they got denial. And at the most basic level, I think, people over there don't feel they could trust government to lead the way, which is quite a change from the past. I know there's a narrative about, Americans are traditionally sceptical about government. That's broadly true, but they haven't been deeply suspicious in the sorts of numbers that we see now. So during most of the 20th century, whether it's through depression, war, any other kind of turmoil you can think of, Americans had actually expressed high faith in their institutions. So if you go back to the mid-1960s, 77% of Americans said that they trusted the federal government to do the right thing, most, or at least most of the time. But in the late 1960s and early 70s, with Vietnam and with Watergate, trust in institutions begins to fall. By 1994, only 1 in 5 Americans said that they trusted their government to do the right thing. Then came the Iraq War, the financial crisis, the election of Trump. Institutional trust levels hopelessly low at this point. But what was different between sort of our time and the 70s, even though trust was going down, what was different about our time was the rise of a large group of people who were actively and poisonously alienated, who were not only distrustful, but explosively distrustful. So this idea of explosive distrust it's not just an absence of trust or a sense of detached alienation, it's an aggressive animosity and an urge to destroy the things in front of you. So explosive distrust is the idea or the belief that those who disagree with you are not just wrong, but illegitimate, almost non-citizens. And in periods of distrust, you get surges of populism. Populism is the ideology of those who feel betrayed. Contempt for insiders rises, as does suspicion towards anybody who holds authority or who has expertise. People are drawn to leaders who use the language of menace and threat, who tell group versus group power narratives. You also get more political extremism. People seek closed, rigid ideological systems that give them a sense of security. Their radius of trust sort of shrinks further, and they only trust their own kind. Donald Trump is a symbol of the age of distrust. When many Americans see Trump's distrust, they see a man who looks at the world as they do. An America in which institutions have failed and financial systems have collapsed. An America in which children can now expect to have a lower quality of life than their parents. So renewal, this is a little depressing, but renewal is hard to imagine in the short or long term. So let me take the short term. I suppose there are still scenarios in which the US may avoid a democratic crisis. In 2024, Biden could win re-election by a wide margin, or a Republican other than Trump could win by a wide margin. Trump might then fade from the political scene and his successors might choose not to embrace election falsehoods. The era of Republican election denial could, under these sorts of circumstances, prove to be fairly brief. It's also possible that Trump or another Republican nominee will try to reverse a close defeat in 2024, but fail again. And if this were to happen, the movement might also begin to fade. But many democracy experts, of which I am not one, worry that these scenarios may be fanciful. I don't think you have to be a democracy expert to think that they're a little bit fanciful. Now, why do I say that? Because Trump's most likely successors as party leader also make or tolerate false claims about election fraud. The movement is bigger than one person. To believe that Republicans will not overturn a close presidential loss in coming years seems to depend on ignoring the public positions of many Republican politicians, and I think we should be worried. Now, the most promising strategy for avoiding an overturned election involves a broad ideological coalition that isolates conspiracy theorising populists and that isolates the election deniers. But it remains unclear how many Republican politicians would be willing to join such a coalition. It's also unclear whether Democratic politicians and voters are interested in making the kinds of compromises that would help them attract more voters from across the aisle. Many Democrats have instead embraced a purer version of liberalism in recent years, especially on social and cultural issues. So the shift to the left has not prevented the party from winning the popular vote in presidential elections, but it has hurt the party outside of the major metropolitan areas, and it will continue to hurt the party outside of the major metropolitan areas. With regard to the longer term, I suppose the question is the United States facing a permanent decline, and what this might mean for Americans in the world? When it was faced with challenges in the past, whether they were in the 70s or in the 50s or in the 30s or going right back to the 1890s, Americans found a way to build new cultures and institutions, to initiate new reforms, to step out in new directions, at home and abroad. I think the first thing to say here is that the United States is unlikely to regain its earlier hegemonic status, nor should it aspire to. What it can hope for, in the best case scenario, is to sustain with allies an international order that's friendly to democratic values into the future. So in the context of rising authoritarianism, the world could certainly do with this. Whether America is ready and able to step up in the world will depend on it recovering a sense of national identity and purpose at home, not least a respect for its own democratic traditions. But we shouldn't be blindly optimistic about this happening. Polarisation has already damaged the US's global standing and its influence. That influence depended in large part on soft power. And by soft power I mean the attractiveness of American institutions and American society to people around the world. That appeal has been greatly diminished. It's hard for anyone to say that American democratic institutions have been working well in recent years, or that any country in their right mind should try and imitate America's political culture. The hallmark of a mature democracy is the ability to carry out peaceful transfers of power following elections, a test that country failed spectacularly in January last year and may well again fail in the future. So I'm sorry I can't be more optimistic than that. I was thinking of trying to end on an optimistic note, but I thought it would destroy my credibility with you. So that's America today. I gave a very different talk in 2008, and I was able to have a look at some notes from that talk because I keep a lot of these things, and it was a very different talk. And maybe I've changed, possibly a little bit, but I think the country has changed in ways that no one could ever have predicted, and there may be more changes ahead of us that we can't predict now. Let's see what the next 24 hours look like anyway. Thank you. I can probably hear. Oh,
We spent a lot of money on these mics. Okay, we good? So, Michael, as you anticipated and you signalled beforehand, we're hoping that there might be a nice uplifting ending to this, but...
Well, they could hold the Senate, the Democrats, that is, but I don't know if that restores the sort of calm that we would all hope for. I think there's going to be a lot of contestation in the next couple of years.
What do you see, and I'm waiting for people to call for one of the mics, but what do you see as happening? You talked about Biden as the presidential candidate.
Yeah.
Is there any alternative to him being the presidential candidate?
Well, you'd start with the vice president, and I would say that she's not a good alternative.
No.
I think she's been a poor performing vice president, and either isn't seen where she should be seen, or is seen in places where you probably prefer that she isn't. I think she's been weak. When I say weak on the southern border, I don't mean that the Democrats should be trying to build walls, but ineffective in relation to that issue, and hasn't been able to establish a good narrative. So I think if Kamala Harris was to run and somehow win the nomination, I doubt that would happen, that she would run. If she did, I don't see how she could beat Trump in 2024. I mean, we have to remember Trump won, I'm not going to get the exact figure right, but 75 million or so votes in 2022. And big pardon, in 2020, sorry. And that's the second most amount of votes in US presidential history. He is quite a popular guy in the US, and he, as I said in the talk, he symbolises anxieties that people feel, some perhaps without much legitimacy, but many with a degree of legitimacy. Now, it's not to say Trump is the person they should be looking to, but he is. Come back to the question though.
Go back to the alternatives.
Yeah,
what are the names we should look at?
There are no names. This is the thing. In 2000, if you go back to 2007, there was Obama, there was Clinton, there was a guy named John Edwards whose career got derailed not long after, but he was seen at the time as a very credible candidate. There were people like Howard Dean, Biden himself was a candidate. There was a cluster of credible Democratic candidates who would have been competitive in any US presidential election campaign. Not so today. You look at the Republican side. There's Trump. I mean, he's the major figure. But there are a few who are waiting around. Ted Cruz, I mentioned in the talk today, is someone who would probably run again with a similar kind of platform to Trump. So there's not really anyone that I can see that has the pulling power or the appeal that Trump has, and who would be able to pull people from Trump to the Democratic Party. A lot can happen in 2 years, but yeah.
Thank you, Michael. That was very interesting. It was fascinating. So my question is around, given the rise of the distrust that's occurring, is that reflected in the voting patterns of certain groups? Given that voting is not compulsory in the United States, so it's kind of like, democracy is under threat, but are they actually exercising their democratic right to favour their particular political interests of distrust?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I mean I talked mainly about the largest group of disaffected voters, and I call them the sort of 40%ers, the white working class and working poor who are doing it pretty tough. But when you look at other groups, 38% of Hispanic voters voted for Trump. 36% of Asian, or 35% of Asian Americans voted for Trump. 19% of black men voted for Trump. After all his misogyny in the 2016 election, 51% of white women voted for Trump. So when people say, Trump is a symbol of white supremacy, I always say, well, it depends on how you're using that term. He's not a white supremacist in any traditional kind of way, because he's able to win over, has been able to win over, and will win over, I think, if he runs in 2024, again, a large or a not insignificant number of, what they call in the United States, people of colour. So in terms of the voluntary voting thing, I'm very grateful we have compulsory voting in this country, because I think it crowds out the extremes in the political process. And what you see in the United States is the elevation of extremes. Most obviously in the form of Trump. But if you push out to the far left of the Democratic Party, the candidates there are never going to be able to credibly win enough voters to take an election, just because of the historical concerns around socialism and big government and the like. So I think two things. You find support for populist politics in the United States today in some unlikely places. And secondly, the extremes that are elevated by voluntary voting, I think, are most acute right now.
Michael, taking this group here, half us, if we were in America, would be voting for Trump or whatever the percentage is. We're not stupid, I don't know most of you, but you don't look like you're stupid. And I'm assuming that American people are not stupid either. So is it possible? It seems hard to us when all the bad things we hear about him. He must be a terrible person, but I'm just can't get my head around the fact that so many presumably good Americans follow him. So is he as bad as he's presented to be?
Well, I think I hope I brought that out in the presentation, that it's not about demonising people who support Trump. In fact, the first step in any kind of reconciling of the nation is to understand why people vote the way they do. And I think I absolutely understand why Americans, a large number of Americans today, feel aggrieved about the political system in which they live. For the reasons I said, the misadventures overseas that have been incredibly costly, the very poor handling of the GFC that, seem to reward the top end of town at the expense of, what we would call battlers. The anxieties that people sometimes feel with massive change. I also, personally, I think of the coal miner in West Virginia who doesn't have a job, whose kids' prospects are probably worse than his, whose community's breaking down under a major drug crisis, being told, for example, that he has white privilege. And I understand why people like that might be upset by that kind of politicking and that kind of message. I absolutely understand that. It's another thing to say that putting your eggs in the Trump basket is a good response to those feelings. And that's where I I think whether Trump's a good guy or a bad guy, I mean, my personal view is that he's not a productive force in American politics. But he's an expression of something that's very real. And if people don't like the current state of American politics, you can sort of go one of two ways. You can denounce Trump and all Trump support. You can denounce all Trump supporters as mad, bad, foolish, bigots, and all of the rest of it. But nothing will change if you do that. My position's always been that in any polity, and certainly in the United States today, that the willingness to talk across the aisle, to understand that someone with a different view from yours is not necessarily a bad person, but they just have a different view. And if you're not prepared to dialogue with them, as people now say, your capacity to change the very thing that you're bemoaning is limited. So no, I think people have legitimate grievances about the United States today. I just don't think Trump is the solution.
Ever since Bush v Gore and the Dade County electoral officials, I've been very concerned the United States has no concept of an electoral commission, such as we have in Australia for state and federal elections, where there's generally accepted to be an independent umpire and all these things. And it concerns me that the number of people who might be elected tonight in the United States as state secretaries of state or state governors will have an influence over how elections are counted in the future, when there seems to be, it's totally politicised the way in which votes are counted and there is no independent umpire. Isn't that a great threat to democracy?
Massive threat, and it's a reflection of the power of states' rights historically in the United States. So the capacity, Americans' capacity to establish a kind of national commission of that kind has always been limited or restricted by its own hesitation about centralising power or authority politically. But it is a major problem, and I think now that there is an election denier movement, which is undeniable. I mean, they're not my words. I mean, people are saying it. I mean, the people who are election deniers are proudly saying, we are election deniers. We do not accept that Biden won. Now, the situation over the last couple of years has not improved. So, one has to assume that when 2024 rolls around, some of those people, in fact I would probably argue all of those people, if they are elected into the relevant positions, Secretary of State positions and so on, will act on that. Out of it would seem a genuine belief that the election is rigged, but on the basis of not only no evidence, but evidence to the contrary. And I think that's the real danger for the US at the moment, where one of the two major parties that has just won 75 million or so votes through Trump in 2020 is saying it's not prepared to make a clear statement about the peaceful transfer of power after an election. That's quite extraordinary. I mean, that's amazing.
Oh, hi, Michael. I was wondering if you could talk about the role that media is playing in dividing the country, particularly maybe the benefit that Russia or China may have in a divided America, and maybe also talk about how it seems like they're designed to misdirect people's frustrations away from potentially larger issues like wealth inequality, which seems to be like a genuine reason that people are frustrated, whereas it seems like media is trying to focus people's attentions on maybe smaller issues. And yeah.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think in terms of China and Russia, I think we're already seeing the consequences of a divided America. An internally divided America can't project any meaningful or valuable sense of itself globally. And if it can't do anything, if it can't do things internally, if it can't get things right at home, its capacity to be effective on the world stage are, I don't want to say nil, but they're certainly limited. In terms of the media, I think, you go back to the early 90s, and you can see the way that American media sort of separates out. If you're watching Fox News, you're getting a particular kind of message about the politics of the day. If you're watching MSNBC, you're getting a very different version of politics. And I think the country managed to hold together despite that in the 90s, because when you're talking media, this is before the advent of social media. And I think social media has such a distorting impact on politics, because people can take, they see one thing and that can be amplified into a phenomenon. And people can assume all kinds of things from either watching or reading about one event online. And this is what we see. And I think across the political aisle, I think there's issues, whether we're talking about race, whether we're talking about foreign policy. What was the other issue you raised? And see, the thing is, wealth inequality, I would argue, sort of sits at the centre of all of this. That there has never been a thriving or stable, even a stable, multi-racial or multicultural or multi-ethnic republic anywhere in the world that's been built on a foundation of economic inequality. It hasn't been. There can't be. And you think about the relationship between economics and culture. When people are losing out, they're looking around at who's not losing or who they don't think is losing. And usually that's where you get issues with native-born people and immigrants. And this is what we see in the United States. But in the midterm elections, good luck trying to find the politician who's talking about the decade-long drift around economic inequality. I haven't heard it from certainly haven't heard it from any Republicans. I haven't really heard a lot of it from the Democrats either this time around. I'm not saying that I've never heard it, but to me, it also could be, I think it's a missed opportunity for two reasons. One, it is the biggest issue, so I think you should, there should be greater focus on it. But if the United States is to get beyond its current tribalism and division, it's going to need something to bring people together, something to build a coalition out of. And the one thing that the black poor and the white poor and the whatever other poor there is have in common is poor. And it could be, and at different times in history has been, an effective instrument around which people organise their socio-economic circumstances. In the United States today, when you go out and read the midterm messaging from the parties, reading about school curriculum, might read a bit about what's going on in Ukraine, important issue, but you might read a bit about the poor handling of COVID, you might read a bit about election denial, but you rarely read about the fact that since the late 1970s, the gap between the haves and the have-nots has been widening, and the burden has fallen disproportionately on the working poor, irrespective of what group they belong to, black, white, whatever. So, yeah. Oh, I think some media is. Oh, absolutely. I don't think all media is, but I think you have to be very careful with media you engage. I think, and some media is very open about it. I mean, there are hosts on Fox News who are very open about their Republican allegiances. Equally, you turn on MSNBC, there are people very open about their allegiance to the Democrats. And I don't think that is necessarily a bad thing, but we actually need, in and of itself, but we actually need to distinguish opinion from news. And that line has become increasingly blurred. I think that's the big change.
I think Rob's got it.
Michael, I really appreciate the systemic perspective that you've offered us tonight. It's not just this issue, it's this whole, and it's historic as well. So thinking about this as a system, and it's not in isolation from the rest of the system of the world as well. When a system is so out of equilibrium and its normal devices and behaviours and institutions are so broken, it's very hard to see any sort of optimistic catharsis. And historically, in situations like that, we'll have a war, a civil war. We'll go to the barricades. We'll fight for our cake or whatever. Yeah. I noted that you tried to not end optimistically tonight, and I'm just a bit curious about not what your prediction is, but what your imaginings are about how this system might find a catharsis that will actually help it move.
Yeah. Thanks. I was saying to my good friends last night and today that I think the only way I, at the moment, can see America moving forward well, or at all, is, I mean, I don't think Trump is part of the solution, but I actually don't think that any Democrat I can see at the moment could win over enough of the 75 million who voted for Trump to sort of put the country back together. Because ultimately that's what you've got to do. I mean, it's not good enough to say Trump's a white supremacist and everybody who votes for him is a bit, because that's just not the case. It's also just, as a matter of fact, incorrect, because a lot of Trump voters voted for Obama in 2008 and 2012. So that kind of discourse of, calling people bad people, so it doesn't really get you anywhere. So I think the most, if I sort of bring imagination together with what I think is also broadly achievable, I think at some point in the next few years, a Republican candidate to emerge in the spirit of a Reagan or a John McCain, now the late John McCain as well, who possibly has a military background, who subscribes to the tenets of kind of traditional conservatism as they've been articulated in the United States for decades, free market, capitalism, America playing a role in the world that's quite active, etc., but fundamentally believing that when you lose, you congratulate the other person and say, you've got the keys to the White House. A person with that kind of profile, military background, hard to really condemn for people on the conservative side of politics in the United States. It's happened, but it's rare. Free market, rule of law, you can have all of that, but with a fundamental commitment to basic truths about American politics and about the system. Now again, you just go back 14 years, you go back to John McCain, and I remember, when he was running against Obama and they're in a town hall, and one of the Republicans in the audience, a citizen, called out that Obama wasn't American, that Obama was born in Kenya and he was a secret Muslim and an Arab. And John McCain stopped the person and said, that is not true. He's a patriot, he's an American. We disagree on many things, but we come together around some core values that go to the heart of what it means to be a country, a functional country. Now, they were not his exact words, but that was the essence of it. I think that's the way, the first step back for America is somewhere within the Republican Party, a McCain, a Reagan, a Romney, who would not alienate Trump supporters that much, who also create opportunities for at least conversations with conservative Christians, who again are repelled at the moment by the Democratic Party and are voting Trump. That, I think, is, if I let my imagination go, I can't see who that person is now, but I think that's where America starts rebuilding. It's with a Reagan for the 21st century, and then that puts politics back on at least some sort of traditional playing field where Republicans and Democrats can actually talk about the issues and what you'll get there, what you could get there, and what certainly in the 80s with Reagan, I was, when I taught a lot of American history, I was not always sympathetic to Reagan. But Reagan didn't say there's no problem of inequality, in a way that Trump sort of just denies reality that he doesn't like. Reagan said, well, there is inequality, but I've just got a different way on I've got a different view on how you address it. Now, we may agree or disagree with that approach, as in, Reagan thought the free market and if you grow the economy, but at least that's a debate within a political family, and you can disagree on the facts. We don't seem to be talking enough these days, and Americans, I get the sense in their political culture, are talking about issues that are raised out on the fringes, and that in any other epoch would have been seen as fringe issues.
Michael, we actually have a question from one of our online viewers. It's true. This question actually comes from someone watching from New Zealand.
Okay.
You better translate it.
I hope I do it justice. The question is around the Russian invasion of Ukraine has brought the potential of nuclear conflict to the forefront of a lot of people's minds. We now have a proposal that there will be B-52 bombers stationed in Australia as a deterrent to any potential Chinese aggression towards what the Chinese see as part of their own country and others see as separate, which is Taiwan. If China becomes, or when China becomes the biggest economy in the world, it will be the first time since 1800 that an Anglo-Saxon, that a non-Anglo-Saxon, non-democratic, non-Western country is the largest economy in the world. What's the impact or the potential attitudes towards China and its impact on Australia as a security partner with the United States of the different Trump versus Biden, the Republicans versus the Democrats? Where is this fit in the...
Okay, look, I'm not a China expert, but I'll say this. I think the most extraordinary thing really about Trump's foreign policy posture is that he's a Republican who's walked away from a particular tradition that had been subscribed to for decades by previous Republican presidents. That is, that the United States, should be a beacon of freedom and hope to people all over the world, and so goes the rhetoric. But that the United States should be actively engaged with the world, and that it should be shaping it, whether in its own image or for its own purposes, but also connected in a way that with Trump we haven't seen. So America First is the principle that has defined Trump's foreign policy, which is basically American retreat from the world. He's the president of borders and walls, of putting up things rather than going out. And when I look at the way the Republican Party has responded on what's happening in Ukraine, when I look at some of its messaging about the Asia Pacific and allies, you wouldn't be confident on any given day of the week that in the event of any conflict involving a new great power, that a future Republican president in Trump's image, if it's not Trump, would honour alliances that we talk a lot about in this country. Biden is more of an internationalist, obviously. I mean, he's repudiated Trump's position on foreign policy and has actively sought to re-engage allies and the international community. Not in the same way as George W. Bush or in the same way as Reagan, but certainly to put America back on the map as an ally that can be depended on and that you can sort of do business with. In terms of China in the region and Australia, I mean, you would have to say, irrespective of your politics now, I think, if we're being really serious, that a Biden presidency gives assurances for our region that a Trump presidency or an equivalent to a Trump presidency doesn't. And again, that's not just me talking. I mean, Trump is on the record as saying that. He doesn't believe in alliances. He doesn't really believe in allies. He believes in America first. And if it's not in America's interest to be in this region for reasons that he defines or that those around him define, they won't be. It's as simple as that.
I think this will be... Well, I've got a question, but we'll take
Thanks.
this one.
You indicated before that you hadn't heard any Republicans in the current election cycle talk about income inequality, and that it was an issue not dealt with by the Republicans in general. I was just to take issue with that, in that if you have a look at, say, J.D. Vance, his whole platform is about income inequality. And if you have a look at the America First movement, a substantial portion of their policy is about income inequality, in particular income inequality between the 40% poor working classes you've identified and between the tech entrepreneur elites, but also the income inequality between the working class of America and other rising working classes, say, for instance, China. So I just wonder how you square that circle of the premise of America First is substantially about income inequality, and then to say that the Republicans and Trump aren't addressing income inequality.
J.D. Vance, yeah, I know J.D. Vance. I mean, how many other people know J.D. Vance? Okay. And people may know J.D. Vance in the future. I suppose what I'm talking about is what are the big national issues that political parties are talking about in the United States? I'm not saying that if I said that no Republican has ever talked about income inequality or there's been no discussion of it, okay, but what I'm saying is, what are the big issues that politicians in the midterm elections, which is what I was talking about, what are the big issues they're talking about at a national level? I'm not going to take issue with you that JD Vance hasn't talked about income inequality. But what is at the centre of the political culture today as major issues? I mean, when you think of Trump's presidency, and I think there's criticism to go around for the Democrats here too. I mean, it's not so much a partisan point, but we had 4 years of Trump between 2016 and 2020, and just to even it out, we'll go back to Obama 2012 to 2016. What were the big initiatives of either of those presidents on income inequality, and what were the big results? I can give you the answer on results. They were bad because income inequality has deteriorated in the last 10 years. So I suppose I'll meet you somewhere on the road here and say, if I said that no one's talked about income inequality, that's not the case. But we are kidding ourselves if we think that the issue of income inequality has been a major issue in the midterm elections, or I would argue in any presidential election recently. And I can't square that with the fact that when I look at the United States, a great country, you know, I mean, it's a country that I chose to be interested in because there's a lot that is captivating and admirable about it, certainly historically. But this problem, 50 years in the making. It has been getting worse for 50 years. And we've had Democratic presidents, we've had Republican presidents. Some of them talk about it, some of them don't. But none of them have actually delivered results. And I think in terms of that 40%, and I want to also make the point that when we're talking about the working class and poor, we're not only talking, I mentioned the 40% working class and white poor, but I'm talking about the black poor, the Hispanic poor, and poor folks from other groups as well. And I think it's unhelpful at a time where you have rising income inequality, at that very time where people are bound by a common experience of living on the wrong side of the tracks, being poor, whatever you want to call it, that their capacity to connect with each other has never seemed to me to be less. You know, I don't see a lot of crossing boundaries at all. But JD Vance will be an interesting person to watch, I think, in the next few years.
We're almost out of time, but I wanted to take my prerogative of finishing with one question. We've spent a lot of time talking about the problems with the Republicans, but you did give us a glimmer of how the Republicans could come back and maybe, save the day. But I would like to know, why are the Democrats so hopeless?
Yeah.
It's a good. Last time, the only people they could come up with were Biden and Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
And you're saying there's no one on the horizon.
I'm glad you asked.
And in Pennsylvania, they've put up a senator who I gather is perfectly fine, but had a major stroke 3 months ago.
Yeah.
And I mean,
it's a really good question. In early 2017, so just after Trump won,
there's a metaphor,
the
by the way. This question could be applied to the Labor Party here almost, but except
indeed. Yeah. So just after Trump won in 2016, so this was in early 2017, I gave a paper at UTS in Sydney on why, on Trump, and there were about 50 academics there, and I went in and I said, look, I could give a paper today about, that starts out, I don't like Trump and I think Trump's bad. the middle is I don't like Trump and I think Trump's bad, and the end is, by the way, I think Trump is bad. I suppose it's not a very interesting paper, and I suspect most people in the room will think that Trump is bad. But if Trump is bad, and if Trump is mad, which is what a lot of people were saying back then it does beg the question, what are the Democratic Party doing wrong? And I think the answer is many things. Some of the things I said then that I would repeat now is, for the first couple of years, and probably arguably still now, the Democrats really haven't come to terms with Trump winning and why he won. And everybody cites Hillary Clinton's comment during the 2016 election, but probably for good reason, when you refer to a group of people as the deplorables, and you use that word as a noun. It's almost as if she was saying that the world would be better if these people didn't exist. And I think there are there are lots of things wrong with that, but two big things. One, it violates the first rule of politics, that attack your opponent but don't attack his or her supporters, because they could be your supporters if you make good arguments. But I think it also formalised, in a kind of way, a line that had already been drawn by many, that there was, a sense that there were people on the other side that are not worth my time, that are not worth me seeing. And I think one of the problems that the Democratic Party has at the moment, I think the Republican Party has its own problems. I've talked quite a lot about those tonight. It's now the Republican Party is primarily non-college educated, white, working class, right, living in smaller cities or rural areas. The Democrats are overwhelmingly college educated and white, with some non-white immigrants. And when you can quite precisely define two parties and their support bases in that way, it suggests to me that they're both doing something wrong, that they're messaging to the same groups with the same messages sort of endlessly. And I think the example I gave of the West Virginian coal miner goes to what's wrong with the Democrats today. That to that guy does not have white privilege. That guy's life is tough. And we can assume bigotry and denounce, and he can be called a deplorable. But that doesn't get you anywhere politically, and it doesn't get you anywhere as a country, really. The alternative for the Democrats, I would argue, is rather than to go down that line, that sort of white privilege line and everything that's connected to that, it should be looking, and I would be critical of the Democrats for this too, it should be looking to talk more about things that all Americans have in common, or most Americans have in common, and that thing is inequality into the future. I don't think the Democrats talk nearly enough, as a party of the sort of centre left, about not only how we understand poverty, but actually how we create wealth and ensure that everybody gets an opportunity to partake in that. So, yeah, no, I think the Democrats are in pretty bad condition at the moment.
Right.
I think I should try and end with
What a-
something
what
more
a happy
optimistic
night.
than that. But
Anyway, I'll ask Rob to wind up
Sure.
and provoke a vote.
Yes, thank you, Michael, very much. And thank you to you for coming. Somebody, and I thought your questions were great. Somebody once said, if you don't take even if you don't take an interest in politics, politics takes an interest in you. And I think what's happening over there in the United States is not just an academic exercise of, oh, that's interesting, but it is something which impacts on people's lives and on your life and my life and the life of our children and our grandchildren and children of the next generations. It will have, the role of the United States is going to have a big role in their lives. So thank you, Michael. We really appreciate it. The next event for us is a rather special one, and it's sort of redundant of me even talking about it. It's on Tuesday week, and 300 tickets have been booked out for that, even though they're free. The 300 tickets have now gone for our next event. So for those, I'd be interested to know who got one. Did any, you know, some of you got, well done to you, well done. If you missed out and you'd still like to listen to Kevin Rudd and talk about the avoidable war, which he refers to with China over Taiwan, the Newcastle Writers Festival is holding an event on the same night, and you can still get a ticket for that. So that's, he'll be having a conversation with Matt Bevan, who some of you may know, and so that would be a fallback position, albeit not as good as the Newcastle Institute one, but and it will cost you $30, whereas ours was free. So, but nevertheless, it's an opportunity. We're very keen about that, and we hope to turn that into an annual lecture series about Australia's place and role in Asia. So that's something to look forward to on a regular basis. If you're interested in the Newcastle Institute and the work that we do, we'd love to hear from you and talk about some topics that you might want to hear about. Let us know, send an email or a message from our website. Talk about what I'd like to hear about this, I'd like to know about that. And if you'd like to become involved and become part of the committee who just tries to meet every now and again and come up with some ideas and put some things together, that would be wonderful as well. So thank you so much for coming, and I wonder, could we just join together and say thank you to Michael one more time?